welcome to the latest edition of In Focus. I'm your host, Leslie Duarte. Today's guest is a professor of psychology in the College of Humanities and Social Science here at the university. She has authored over 100 articles and book chapters in addition to 6 books of her own. In 1991, she founded the Twins Study Center here on campus. I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Nancy Segal.
Hello, Leslie. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I'm so excited to talk about everything and your research. I think it's fascinating, all the work that you have done.
Well, let's talk about it.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm from New York City originally, and I'm a fraternal twin, which is how I got into this whole field. I have a sister who looks and acts nothing like me, and it was these behavioral and physical differences that I found so fascinating in 2 children growing up at the same time in the same family. And so when I became a psychology major, I began to research this area and found twin research utterly fascinating because I could relate to it in a professional and a personal manner. And it just became my career ever since.
What have you learned in your study of twins? Because, one of your books is about how genetics can influence twins. But in your situation with your sister, you're saying that it was the opposite. So what have you learned?
No, I'm saying it's precisely that.
Oh, wow.
That the different genes that we inherited from our parents, after all, fraternal twins, like full siblings, share half their genes on average. And so what twin studies tell us is that many more of our behaviors, including intelligence, personality, our religious interest and investment, our job satisfaction, have a genetic component at some level. And the twin research method is so simple and yet so elegant. We simply compare the similarities of genetically identical twins to genetically non-identical or fraternal twins. And for the most part, we find that the identicals are more alike. Now, studying twins raised apart from birth is even more powerful, because then if you look at identical twins raised in different environments, you get the same genes in different settings. And if those twins end up being alike, which they do, this tells us in even more persuasive way that genes underlie so many of our behaviors and how we develop as we do.
That reminds me of the Jim twins that you studied.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the Jim twins were the first pair that launched the Minnesota study of twins raised apart, which I worked on for 9 years as a postdoctoral fellow before coming here to Cal State Fullerton. And the Jim twins were 39 years old when they met for the first time. They lived in different cities in Ohio. And when they met, Leslie, they discovered that they both bit their fingernails to the nub. They both had named their sons James Allen. They both scattered love letters around the house for their wives. And they both had developed very severe headaches at the same time in adolescence. And there are many more similarities I could name, but when you think about all these similarities in individuals who never knew each other and who were also raised with adoptive siblings and did not show resemblance to them, this really tells you that genes are a powerful influence, not the whole influence, but a powerful influence on so many of our developmental traits.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And, these are a lot of accomplishments and a lot of research that you have done. Can you tell us more about your accomplishments in your career?
Well, I have many twin research projects that are ongoing right now that involve so many of my students. And one of them involves social closeness in twins. Now, it's a little bit of a tricky design, but I think you can understand it. When identical twins marry ordinary people and have children, the children from the 2 families are first cousins. Right? But because they share a genetically identical parent, they are genetically equivalent to half-siblings. And each identical twin aunt or uncle, depending upon whether the twins are the mothers or the fathers, are the genetic mothers and fathers to their nieces and nephews. And so I've been comparing families like that to the ordinary garden variety fraternal twin families. And I find that the identical twin aunts and uncles feel socially closer to their nieces and nephews, which in a sense are like their children. But that's just one of many studies. I study bereavement.
What is bereavement?
When one loses a close relative. So I study if losing a relative is a more grief intensive event for identical twins, that they lose an identical twin as opposed to losing a fraternal twin. And it is slightly more devastating. I also look at the loss of a twin versus the loss of other relatives, and that also seems to be right up there. It's a devastating event that I wish bereavement counselors could pay more attention to. I have a study on Chinese twins separated apart, indirectly through the one-child policy that limited urban families to one child and rural families to two. And so I now have gathered 22 of these families, and I've been prospectively following these twins as they develop, which in a way is an improvement over existing reared-apart twin studies because they mostly study adults who meet when they're older, whereas I'm following the kids as they develop over time. So I get observations from parents and from teachers. So I'm really excited about that study. I'm about to write up my first set of results. And then, let's see, I have a study on Fascinating on people who look alike but are not genetically related.
That is interesting. I was hoping that would come up in our conversation.
Yeah. Well, why is it important? It's important from the twin research perspective because many people think that twins are alike in personality because people treat them alike based on their similar appearance. But I would argue that people treat identical twins alike because their behaviors evoke certain responses, evoke the same responses from those around them. But the best way to test that is through lookalikes. And so I predicted that lookalike people would not be at all similar in personality because there's no necessary connection between how you look and how you behave. And I proved to be right. And so this is a very important way of countering the challenges that some of our critics raise. So I'm very excited about this. I have found a colleague in Canada who's a photographer, and he studies, well, he doesn't study, he photographs look-alike people, so he provided me with about half of my sample. So I find a lot of them on my own as well.
How did you get your sampling again?
There's a Canadian photographer, and his hobby is to photograph look-alike people. And when I found out about it, I said, you know, I'd love to get the names and addresses of these guys, and I could provide them with my questionnaire. And he wouldn't allow that, but he said, you send me the questionnaire. You know, he's a good researcher, and he'd pass it out to those people. And then I was lucky enough to hook up with the BBC, or it was a British broadcasting company, and they were doing a project on this. So they gave me a good number of twins, or a good number of lookalikes, and I found some on my own. So I even found a pair here at Cal State Fullerton. So,
oh, really?
Yeah.
How did you find that pair?
I had a former student who left to go to graduate school. And one day in the restroom, I saw a woman who looked exactly like her, or almost exactly like her. And so the two of them are now in my project.
Wow, that is so interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think I always had that question of like, you look exactly like somebody that I met or somebody that I know, and it's completely not the person. And it's fascinating that, you know, you're studying this, but you've also done other research study. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I've done some study on cooperation and competition between twins. This was actually one of the first studies I've ever done. And I looked at whether or not identical twins working as a unit on a common project would show greater cooperation than fraternal twins. And this involved young children between the ages of 7 and 10. And it was just gorgeous, Leslie. I would give the kids the puzzle, and I'd say, solve it together. And the identical twins were very coordinated, very cooperative, almost like a dance, where they were sensitive to what the other was doing, and they completed the puzzle rather quickly and efficiently. But the fraternal twins are kind of messy because they have very different information processing styles and very different temperaments and personalities and understandings. And so it was kind of a mess. It almost looked like two puzzles for a while. And so we would look at these films and make judgments about them. And yeah, it was a fascinating project.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing is that identical twins and fraternal twins aren't only, it's not just about how you look, but also about how you process information. Can you, can you explain that to our viewers?
Well, yeah, it's like how you perceive the world, how you react to people and places and events. And we all react in our own unique ways, and it's a product of who we are genetically and what some of our past experiences have been. And what's interesting is that the same experience is not the same for all children in a family. You know, parents could provide computers, let's say, and for one child it's sheer heaven. Another child is nothing but drudgery, and they'd rather be out on the sports field. So it's wrong to think that treating children the same is fair treatment. The rule that I usually go by is that you have to tailor your treatment to each individual child. I usually tell parents that parents of one child are geneticists and parents of one child are environmentalists and parents of two are geneticists, because parents of two children realize that what works for child A does not work for child B. Now, something else I should point out is that twin research not only informs us about who we are and why we got that way, but it also has some really important practical applications. And what never occurred to me was that the work that I do on twin relationships was very important in cases of medical malpractice and wrongful death and injury in twins. You know, what does it mean to lose a twin, say, if hospitals make a mistake? Well, you're losing companionship, you're losing a source of revenue, all kinds of things that lawyers have thought about. And so I've testified in a number of such cases, and also cases of cheating. Do you know that identical twins often will come up with the same mistakes, same test scores, same narrative that they write? It's really amazing. But it doesn't surprise someone like me, because I expect that. But to some professors and instructors and educators who are not familiar with twins, this sounds like cheating.
What do you mean? Explain that.
Well, you know, two people in a class should not come up with exactly the same test scores or make exactly the same unusual mistakes. And so when they do, then it sometimes raises a red flag. And so some of these students have unfairly been accused of cheating. And I really feel for them. I've known cases where one has been suspended or thrown out of the school or put on probation. And so I go to bat for these kids when I'm informed of the story. And I really point out in the literature that shows that genetics underlies so many of our behaviors and traits and our response to education. And this, I think, has helped a lot of those people.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so important.
That's so interesting that, you know, a lot of times people would, you know, have these misconceptions of twins and not understand the full extent of what it means to be a twin.
Well, you're exactly right. And in fact, it's not twin misconceptions, but twin mythconceptions. That's the title of my 5th book that came out last year. And what it includes is a whole series of false beliefs and fables that people really believe about twins. For example, people think that boy-girl twins can be identical. Well, they can't be, because they form from 2 separate eggs fertilized by 2 separate sperm, and they have the sex difference. Another widespread misconception is that identical twins always have 1 placenta and fraternal twins have 2, whereas fully 1/3 of identical twins have separate placenta, and the placenta may fuse in about 50% of fraternal twins. So that's another misconception. And then another one, which is that twins should always be routinely separated in school. That's one I've really gone to bat with educators, teachers, and I fight for parents all the time on this, because schools worry, without any research basis, that twins will not end up being individuals if they're not separated. But we know from research that good friends who go to school together do better early on, and no one worries about them not being individuals. So what I tell parents is, you know better than anyone. You should insist that your kids stay together and just track their progress over time. I think one really nice solution, if you have identical twins, is to have them dress a little differently, cut their hair a little differently so people can tell them apart and know their name. Maybe put them at different tables so that they can develop maybe some separate friendships, but they can still see each other and know that the other one is close by. There's lots of options if people would just be a little bit creative.
Wow, I mean, this is fascinating. And I keep thinking about, like, the parents that have multiple twins and different sets of twins. I mean, that's a whole nother research study. I'm sure one day you will get to it.
There are so many that I'd like to do. I mean, it's just, I just don't have the time.
You know, I'm fascinated with your study, but how has being yourself a twin influenced more in depth of your studies?
Right. Well, of course, as I think I told you earlier, my being a fraternal twin has really engaged my interest in this whole topic and given me a professional and personal investment in it. I think what's been important is that I can connect so easily with the families and with the twins, because we all share something of vital importance, and we know that from the moment that we meet. And we have certain understandings about what it's like to be a twin, certain unspoken understandings. And so, I mean, it's been marvelous in that respect. And, you know, I've also thought a lot about why is it that people are so fascinated with twins. I mean, you yourself are, and I have to say that when I go traveling and I'm in a shuttle bus or a plane and people ask what I do, they immediately have a million twin stories and they want to hear more. And I think the reason, Leslie, is that we all expect individual differences in appearance and in behavior, so that when we encounter two people who look and act so much alike, it challenges our belief in the way that the world works. And we find ourselves drawn into that. We wanted to know, how has this come to be? And what is it like to be that way? And for some people, all that kind of closeness may be off-putting, but still intriguing. So I think it's that uniqueness that draws us. And I've also spent some time studying twin athletes. I'm fascinated by them. And I think it's extraordinary when you have two people who perform at elite levels. And so if there's a marathon with thousands of people, they may come in 1 and 2 or 4 and 5 right behind each other. And we think, my God, that's amazing. But I think that there are ways we can understand that scientifically. After all, sports ability is a combination not just of experience and training, but also of how your body is put together. What kind of muscles and stamina do you have? What kind of work ethic do you have? So I think it's no surprise that we see identical twins performing at the same elite level. And the other thing that's unique about them, that many of them will tell you, is that when they were children, other kids who were good in sports would go home, have to be by themselves. But the twins would go practice on their own, and if one did a little better, the other one would catch up. So they kind of keep abreast of one another. It's spur each other on, so to speak.
This is interesting. And, you also, in 1991, you opened the Twin Study Center here at the university. Tell us about that.
Well, the Twin Study Center exists here on the campus. It's a named unit within the Department of Psychology. And it has two functions, actually. One is to promote the research of myself, my students, and faculty who are interested. And we have a lot of publications and projects that have been co-conducted and co-authored with other faculty here at Cal State Fullerton and around the U.S. and around the world. The other function is to provide information to the interested public and other professionals. I have a large library with all kinds of wonderful resources, journals, books, films, things like that. And so I think of it as a resource. I do a lot of public speaking. I gave a TEDx talk in November. And
congratulations.
Thank you. It was very exciting.
How did you get to do that?
TEDx is a funny kind of a process. You had to be recommended usually. Either recommended or whoever was organizing it finds you somehow. So I was recommended for that. And so it was a wonderful experience. And a lot of my students showed up, which was very exciting.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was great. And you're really educating a lot of people at once. That's the great thing about it. And so I enjoy public speaking. I speak to parents of twins clubs groups. I speak to professional societies. I send out information. I get phone calls and emails, now mostly emails, of course, on a daily basis. I get them from twins. I get them from students doing projects. And I will tell you honestly, without bragging, I answer every single one. I do not let one go by. I particularly am sensitive to the young students who say, they're so adorable. They'll say, I'm 10 years old and I'm doing a project and I found you online. Would you mind answering 1,000 questions for me? So I write back and I say, I'll be happy to answer 3 brief questions. And usually they're very good about that. And that's a nice feeling, and I can tell them where to go for more information and things like that. And usually these are twins, too, who just want to learn more about themselves.
It's so sweet. And so, you do a lot of this, and a lot of your books talk about this, but tell us about your new book that's coming out this year.
Well, I have a new book coming out in April 17th. It's called Accidental Brothers, The Story of Exchange Twins and the Power of Nature and Nurture. Several years ago, a colleague contacted me, and she's from Columbia University and also from Colombia, South America. And she said that she'd heard about a case of 2 sets of identical twins born in Colombia 25 years ago. This was now 3 years ago, so the twins are 28. And she said that the one pair born in Bogota and the other pair born in the north, 150 miles away. And one of those little boys was very sick, so he had to be brought to Bogota for the better hospital. He was there for a week, and sometime during that week, he was exchanged with the twin in the other pair. So the wrong twin was taken home, and they grew up as copies of the same unrelated pair, because they were both identical. So you had twin A's growing up together and the twin B's growing up together, but they looked nothing alike and were genetically unrelated.
I am confused.
Okay, you're confused. Okay, here's one pair of identical boys. Here's another pair. Okay, this little boy was sick. Bringing him down to the hospital, they exchanged him, see, with the twin in the other pair. So the wrong baby went home.
Wow.
Right. So the parents just assumed that these are fraternal twins and they're going to be different, and that's the end of the story. But then the boys in the north moved to Bogota and they became butchers. And somebody who worked with one of the Bogota twins went to the butcher shop. And she said the first thing she thought of is, what is my coworker doing behind the counter? And she called him Jorge, and he said, my name is William. Jorge, William, Jorge, William. She took a photograph of him, showed her friend, and everybody had a big laugh over the look-alike. And the thing kind of settled down for a year. The story got revisited. The friend who confused the two of them began to study the situation, did some research, and it turned out what I just told you, that one of the boys had been brought down and accidentally exchanged. So there was a reunion when they were all about 25. And, you know, I went down to Bogota twice. And I have to tell you that when I hear about an unusual situation, I go for it. Because I can't help myself. I'm too fascinated. So I went down to Bogota twice with my colleague. Her name is Jessica Montoya. I went with her twice to Bogota. And I went with her once to Bogota, and then I went again myself. And we studied them, we interviewed them, and then the product of that is the book, Accidental Brothers. And we have a paper that came out in the journal Epigenomics that came out last year. And I have another paper right now in the works.
That is so interesting. I'll make sure to get a copy of that and read up on it.
I think it's a pretty fascinating read.
It's so interesting. Yeah. Oh man, I can just imagine their interaction. When you first met the pairs, what did they say? What did they tell you?
Well, by then they'd known about each other for 6 months. But I think what's more interesting is to think about what it was like when they first met each other. And we heard that whole story. And of course, it was especially traumatic for the guys who were raised in the wrong place, because suddenly their parents aren't their parents, their twin isn't their twin, their birthday isn't their birthday. They were born a day apart. So suddenly their whole life is a lie in a sense, and someone else is living the life they should have lived. So it's very traumatic. But I will say that these four made the best of their situation. They look at it as not losing a brother or losing a family, but gaining. And so now they're a tight-knit group of four, charming, gracious guys, a pleasure to work with.
What an interesting story. What an interesting book. We will be looking forward to this book for sure.
Great.
Is there anything else you want to share with us?
Well, just that if anybody has any twin questions or issues or interesting stories, you could send me an email to the Cal State Fullerton website. That's nsegal@fullerton.edu. And I have a wonderful twin-based website, if I do say so myself. It was not designed by me. It was designed by identical twins who call themselves the Twiners. They have a wonderful little website design business, and that's drnancysegaltwins.org. And you can read all about the Twin Center, my books, my research, everything's on there.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a pleasure having you. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Nancy Segal, once again for joining us. You can find the links to all of the information discussed on today's show in the description box below. Once again, I'm Leslie Duarte. Thank you for watching In Focus.